Let me, first of all, go back in time because I have founded 5 nonprofit organizations. And if I'm going to tell you about them, I have to start way back. And I'm going to go back to 1967, when I had landed in Los Angeles after graduating college, Scripps College in Claremont with a BA degree, and I immediately left for an Israeli kibbutz, and I was gone for as long as I could be gone. But I came back, landed in LA in 1967, divorcing from a marriage that I had to an Israeli artist and with a small baby. And I was broke. And I was really concerned about how I was going to survive. So I found out that LA County was hiring people with BA degrees. This was a year after the Watts riots, basically, a year and a half. And there was a lot of social justice activity going around. And the LA County Department of Public Social Services was hiring pretty much anybody who passed some criteria with a BA degree and giving them on-the-job training to become case managers, social workers. So I suddenly found myself with a caseload of 60 single-parent families, single mothers in South Central LA. It took me 3 months of on-the-job training, and I was assigned. And I did that work for approximately a year, until I realized, although I had been realizing it from the beginning, that I wasn't there because LA County cared about what happened to my clients. I was there to make sure nobody cheated. So that was not actually something that I was willing to be a part of, and I'll tell you the true story. The true story is I quit and immigrated back to Israel because I wasn't going to live in a country that treated its citizens that way. So this is idealism at its height, right? I was back within 3 months, and the county reinstated me, and they gave me a new caseload in an area called Metro North, which was basically from Skid Row, the LA River, through downtown LA, MacArthur Park, and Westlake, and a little tiny bit of East, probably just up to Santa Monica Boulevard. But my caseload were people being released from the state hospital. So I suddenly had, and I was suddenly the only contact with anybody in the community, 60 people who had been in state hospitals between the ages of 18 and 64. Over that, they became part of aid to the elderly, which I'm in now. So what I can tell you is that of my 60 clients who have been released into the community without the day treatment centers that were supposed to be also set up to make sure they took their medications and make sure that they could integrate into the community, they didn't become homeless. So you can imagine where this is going. My chronically mentally ill clients somehow knew how to stay in housing. If in fact they needed to have the county be a payee to their landlord for rent, then we did that. But otherwise, unless they had a wild party, and that happened when I put 2 of my clients together in an apartment, and they both got kicked out. But other than that, people knew how to stay housed. So I worked for LA County for approximately 3 years total, 2 full years in downtown LA Skid Row. But by 1971, I quit my job with the county completely and just utterly frustrated at my inability to help people who I felt were caught up in a system that seemed by its very nature geared to just keeping them down. These early experiences would impact greatly on my work later on. So I was not sure at that point what to do. Friends of mine went to actually enrolled at USC and through a program with LA County and got their MSWs and went back and gave 5 years to the county. I left. I went to UCLA and enrolled in the School of Education using student loans and my $500 in retirement funds that I had accrued. And taught in a school, an elementary school in South LA for about 3 months until I realized that that really was not what I was supposed to be doing. So I left that job. At this point, I thought I had adult ADD. But I share this with all of you, especially if you're in your 20s or 30s. I mean, that's what we're supposed to do, be trying things out and experimenting and finding our place in the world. And so at that point, I remarried, spent the next couple of years having 2 more children, 2 daughters, 3 years apart, and that pretty much takes care of my 70s. I had quit the county. I wasn't going to have anything more to do with any of that. I was waiting for the next stage of my life. So during this period, though, there was deep within me a feeling that there was something I was supposed to do, but I just couldn't figure out yet what it was. And now I'm going to jump ahead to 1979. It seems that every night that year there was something on the news about starvation in Biafra or genocide in Cambodia. And like everybody, I'm sure, I felt like, why isn't somebody doing something? I wish I could do something. I wish I could fly over there and just pick up that child off the ground and swat the flies off his face. I want to do something, but I can't. One woman alone, I can't do anything. And so I would fall off to sleep, wake up in the morning with it pretty much out of my mind, but not completely. And everything else would kind of go back to normal. Then one morning, the suffering came too close to home. In November 1979, there was an article in the LA Times about children living in Skid Row hotels. This was a setup for me in a way. Many people in the community read this article. It was 3 pages in the Metro section at that time with photos. And a lot of people reacted to the idea that small children were living and playing in Skid Row hotels and in the alleyways. So it hit me a little bit harder than most because guess what? You know, I had been in those hotels. I had smelled the urine on the stairways. I had walked amongst the broken glass on the front doorstep. I had real knowledge about who else was living in those hotels with those children and their families. And I tried to ignore this article. It was a Sunday morning article. By Thursday, I had acted. By Thursday, I called the LA Times and I said, I want to help, what's going on? And I was told that there was a meeting being held at a mission in Skid Row that Saturday. So within, 6 days even. I went down to the meeting on Saturday and there were probably 50, 60 people in the room at the mission on Winston Street, St. Vincent de Paul. And people began talking about what they were going to do, what they wanted to do. One lady came up with a food and clothing drive. I had by then figured out, and this is my light bulb moment number 1, from reading in the article that children of school age were going to be enrolled in school. They were sending out PSA counselors. But meanwhile, young children, infants to 4 to 5 years old, were being locked in hotel rooms while their parents worked. And sometimes 12, 13-year-old girls were kept out of school so they could babysit 5 or 6 younger ones. So, to me, that's the inspiration for my light bulb moment number 1. I had never been involved in early childhood education, but it seemed quite obvious to me that an appropriate response to that knowledge would be to fill in the gap and develop a child care center in Skid Row. So I presented that idea to the meeting, and they had sign-ups afterwards. Nobody signed up with me. Everybody signed up with a food and clothing drive, which I think is nice to do for people. But I was learning that that's not what I would do when faced with a challenge. I'm more hands-on, and I had a lot of background experience that motivated me to jump right in, and within a week I was walking again the streets of Skid Row. I was like a woman possessed, like making up for everything I had seen before and experienced working for LA County and watching the news. Within 2 months, I had figured out through a book that told me how to incorporate a nonprofit organization which I didn't think people got paid to work in. Honestly, I worked for a year, full-time, before I found out when I opened the doors of Para Los Ninos that in fact people who were coming to work were going to get paid, and the foundations weren't something you just built a house on. So it was a learning process, and I opened my house almost immediately to meetings, one night a month and one afternoon a month, and opened the doors to anybody who wanted to come in. So I had a group of people helping me out, eventually an attorney, because I walked in to become a 501c3, walked to the desk and said, give me the forms, I'll sign them, and found out that in fact that was a whole process that might require an attorney. Almost exactly, 1 year later, in January 1981, we opened our doors to 90 children ages 6 weeks to 5 years of age in an old warehouse on 6th Street. And I literally walked through the hotels and pulled kids in. So within a few years, we had taken over the entire block. I had foundations calling me. I didn't apply to them. The LA Times had an article almost immediately about somebody starting a child care center in Skid Row. This was like the second month of me starting to do that, trying to do that. I called up the LA Times and I said, can you tell me who's doing that? Because I wanted to join with them. Of course, it was me. So, but within a few years, we had expanded to the entire block, and this is when I found my voice, because the challenges that I faced trying to help these people, children and families living in those Skid Row hotels, were multiple, constant. People wouldn't talk to me. Where was I from? I said I was born in San Francisco. That's not what they meant. Who's behind you? So of course I just went to the mayor. Bill Parent, a professor at UCLA, loves that story because I'd never been in City Hall. But when you find out that you've got a voice and you're becoming the voice for people without a voice, that voice often can get louder, especially when the challenges that are presenting themselves mean that if you stop and you find it difficult, then they're going to not get help. So today there are 6 early education centers, 3 charter schools, family support and mental health programs, and they're serving 5,100 families and children a year. So Para Los Niños could have been my life work, it would have been enough, but I was continually bothered by the fact that the children were forced to go back to live in those transient hotels that had not been renovated since I'd been in them first in the 70s, and were certainly not conducive to health and well-being of the children living there. So, but let me go back in time and put 2 pieces together. The fact that these children were forced to live in these hotels was because there was no other affordable housing available for families with children at that time. And in the period of time that I had left Skid Row and then come back, housing affordable to people, and these were mainly working people in the garment industry, at the lower levels had pretty much begun to disappear. But I have to tell you about my experiences in Skid Row when we opened our doors and when I was first working down there finding the warehouse and getting set up 1980, 81. There were no people living on the streets. It hadn't hit yet. It had hit in New York. New York had the first homeless people living on the streets because they pretty much destroyed, took down, rehabbed all their bottom level of affordable housing to bring back a tax base from the suburbs and to develop high-end apartments. And that was in the late 70s. But it didn't hit LA until 1983. There were no people on the streets. If they were homeless, and there were homeless people, they stayed at night in the missions. the missions could accommodate them. And they were often transient. I called them transients. But in 1983, it was almost as if it happened overnight. We began to see people sleeping on the streets. So by me going down to Para Los Ninos and opening Para Los Ninos in 1981, I found myself in a very unique position by 1983. So not only were the lines at the Catholic Worker Soup Kitchen just across the street growing longer, but we began to see families coming to our front door. I'd come in on Monday morning, and there would be lineup of families with children of all ages, including babies and strollers, trying to get help because the missions weren't serving families at that time. So we began to provide FEMA vouchers for hotels for 28 days. Now that was not enough to get somebody housing. So we partnered with Travelers Aid, and 28 days plus 28 days gave us 56 days, and we did it. In those days, we could still do it. We could get people into housing within about, under 60 days, and that's how we tried to address homelessness. But I was still quite bothered by the fact that more homeless families kept coming in. In fact, they were coming from New York on the Greyhound bus, or from the Midwest when factories were being closed down. So in the spring of 1983, I was invited to speak at a charrette on redevelopment in downtown LA. It was being conducted by, of course, the Community Redevelopment Agency. And I spoke about families living in transient hotels and about children, homeless children, coming to us for shelter with their families, including living in parks in different parts of LA. And this article was then posted within, it was in the LA Times that next week in the op-ed section. And there was a lot of reaction to it, but that night I had my light bulb moment number 2. The CRA charrette leader, an urban planner, and I started talking about the problem, and we came up with the idea of LA Family Housing. We would incorporate a new nonprofit called LA Family Housing, and we would demonstrate that you could do housing for very low-income people, for families that didn't have to look like public housing projects, because this was at the time that places like Cabrini Green and other large high-rise or multiple building assisted housing or public housing projects were looking like they were basically just segregating people in poverty and keeping them there. So we thought we would just demonstrate that you could do a small infill project and have it look beautiful, and then all the big developers, and we would add a social services component so the families would get help getting jobs and getting child care and moving up the economic mobility ladder, and then new families could move in. And this would demonstrate to the big developers and to the federal government, this was such naivete, let me tell you. It takes a lot of naivete. At that point, I was still hopeful that, people cared, and there was enough sanity out there at the level where people controlled the money and the decision making to do this. It's the right thing to do, right? So we did our first 8-unit townhouse project on Adams in South Central LA, and I envisioned kind of a mini kibbutz. I brought in a social worker from Para Los Ninos to provide services coordination and crisis intervention. I had small garden plots in front of each townhouse unit. And I brought in one tenant who would be the child care provider for the other women. And this is where the humbling aspects of social services came home. My developing the housing did not give me the right to control what anybody did in that housing. Years later, I became a housing rights activist, which I am to this day. Housing is a basic human right, and as long as you pay the rent, and as long as you behave according to the tenant-landlord covenants, then it is your right, even if you don't feel like going to work that day. If you're paying the rent, it's your right. And I have had been the moderator on panels in Washington, D.C., in which it almost ended up in a huge, literally fist fight among people with opposing views. So the light bulb moment there was, due to a dwindling supply of affordable housing for families with very low incomes, many were becoming homeless, seeking shelter at Skid Row missions or moving into transient hotels. And the response on my part was to create an organization dedicated to the development of affordable housing and provide a services coordinator to each site to assist families to break the cycle of poverty, and this would make everybody follow. So looking back, as I said, it was a humbling experience, and I learned a lot from that experience, that there were going to be many fine lines in the work that we were doing, and that it would be a constant struggle to learn to balance and not to cross over those lines. So in 1986, I resigned as executive director of Para Los Ninos to become full-time director of LA Family Housing. And by then, we were in the middle of developing the first family shelters in Los Angeles that were not domestic violence shelters. There was no money to develop affordable housing. The CRA gave us $500,000, and that was our one and only project at that time, although we did a few more infill projects after that. But there was suddenly, through the McKinney-Vento funding in Washington, D.C., at the federal level in 1987, it was actually codified into law, and it exists to this day. They began to allocate funding for homeless people. And it was really important that they were really homeless, and so that began the institutionalization of the term homelessness, and what criteria would be used to determine that, in fact, you fit that criteria. So we did 2 family shelters between 1986 and 1988. And by 1988, what I was seeing was families cycling through every shelter in town, year after year, month after month. At the end of 2-3 years, where were most of them? Even if they had gone back into housing, they often fell out again. They were homeless. They were exactly where they were when they started. So it seemed to me that there was something wrong. And what came to mind to me from my experience was that once you became homeless, and this is good knowledge for today, please, you probably have bad credit. You probably have an eviction in your history. Because you're homeless, nobody's going to want to rent to you. You might have other reasons why you can't compete for the small numbers of subsidized or affordable housing units that might be out there, were you even to know about them. And it just seemed quite obvious to me, and this was my light bulb moment number 3, just learning as I went along, learning the most from the people we were trying to serve, was that developing, sorry. I'm going to go to so I was with LA Family Housing, let me say, for 5 years. In 1988, I quit completely to start 2 nonprofit organizations. Beyond Shelter, which would respond to the fact that families weren't able to get beyond shelter, okay, and A Community of Friends. And I want to digress and go back to A Community of Friends because it actually came first. In April of 1988, I was approached by a supervisor at the LA County Department of Mental Health asking if LA Family Housing would be interested in developing housing for the chronically mentally ill homeless on the streets of downtown LA. And I said no. Why would I want to do that? It was hard enough doing housing for families who were dysfunctional or unstable. And I knew my board would not want to do that. But I immediately responded with a light bulb moment response, and that was, why not create a new nonprofit entity? I said to her, that same conversation, what we need to do is create a new nonprofit entity dedicated to the development of affordable housing for the chronically mentally ill, and it should always be done in partnership with a mental health agency in the community nearby, either public or private. Now, none of this is rocket science, okay? None of this is rocket science. I actually call it the Emperor's New Clothes School of Social Work, which is a whole story in itself, because it is not rocket science. There was a lot of money at the state level at that point to develop housing for people with chronic mental illness who were homeless, and the big developers weren't touching it. And so that is in fact exactly what we did. We created a community of friends, which I have to tell you, that within 2 years we had 2 model projects completed and had hired a young urban planner from MIT as the agency's first executive director. Today, a community of friends has completed 47 permanent supportive housing projects. I just talked to the current executive director yesterday. 5 that they turned over to their social services partner after 5 years of operations. 42 currently in the portfolio with 16 apartments, 80% of them with formerly homeless individuals and families also affected by mental illness. 2 projects in the under construction and 6 in the pipeline. Now, this was the first permanent supportive housing project in the United States. And how do I know this? Because in 1990, when I advertised nationally for an executive director, I suddenly got a phone call from the director of the National Mental Health Law Project in Washington, D.C., which is now called the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. And he flew out a month later to interview for the position. And he told me, he said, I have never heard of anything like this. Now, there was a lot of housing for people being released from state hospitals, but it wasn't independent rental housing. It was board and care homes, or you then went to independent living, which many people fell out of and then started all over. So he clearly stated that he had never heard of this. And although, again, there was some development of special needs housing, which would be for anybody with special needs, which they could have just kept doing that, and that would have been fine. But a lot of this relates to what's going on in our streets today, and a lot of this relates to why I feel so firmly that, that maybe the homeless are here to stay. And excuse me, we don't use the term the homeless. People experiencing homelessness might be here to stay. So let me go on to Beyond Shelter. At the same time that I was developing a community of friends, I also launched Beyond Shelter. And all I can say in my defense that because the early stages of nonprofit creation are stressful and risky, as much so as any private business startup, and there weren't like venture capitalists that I could go to. But then, by then, I had begun to appreciate the credibility my early work had given me, and I felt a total, complete responsibility to continue that work in the direction it was leading me, no matter how hard it was, and it was hard. My husband got cancer in 1983, and he died in 1985, and in 1986, I became a single mother again, and I had, children to raise, and I was starting another nonprofit in the middle of it. So I'm sharing that with you, which I don't always do, just simply to tell you that at some point it dawned on me that I had become a voice for people whose voices were not being heard. And my voice, believe me, was getting louder and louder. The harder it all became, the louder my voice, which doesn't make you a lot of friends. But it does get things done, and I was getting things done. And people's suffering was being alleviated because of that. So the light bulb moment with Beyond Shelter was, once homeless, I already repeated that to you, it's very difficult for families to get back into housing on their own. The response, develop a new nonprofit organization, my fourth at that point, that would serve as the next step for families in the emergency shelter and then transitional housing system, because I can tell you, if anybody's ever worked with homeless people, crisis intervention and crisis services take all your time and energy. You never get to the next step. And what the shelter system was doing was kind of hoping, beyond hope, that families and individuals who they sheltered would somehow read the bulletin board and be able to go out and apply for a rental unit on the that was advertised on the bulletin board that was already taken, of course, and that they had no car to get to anyway. But that's sort of what was going on, even in my own two shelters that were models, that were being recognized by the federal Department of HUD, you know. So, because each one was bigger and better than the next, but it was not the solution. The solution, it dawned on me, was to address the problem of how do you get back into housing. And I was told by everybody I spoke to, because I always went to my colleagues in the field to test these crazy ideas, which to me seemed very simply logical of the next steps. And I was told that I really couldn't do Beyond Shelter because there was no affordable housing, which said to me, then our job, this is how I know what to do each day, our job is to address that challenge. We need to figure out how to get these people back into housing. I had no answers at that time, but I knew that I was either going to go home, get in bed, pull the covers up, and never look at another homeless family again, or I was going to figure out how to do that. And somebody said, why don't you talk to Della Richardson? She runs a housing relocation firm. Just talk to her. I called her on the phone. She had recently helped to relocate 5,000 families from the Century Freeway project, from neighborhoods that were being taken down in South LA. And she said, oh, of course, if you know Dell, she's married to Curran Price. She's a strong, loud woman. She said to me, well, of course we can find housing for them. So I said, okay, and I opened the doors. And she was my second hire. My first hire was a urban planning graduate out of UCLA who had worked for the Shelter Partnership. I was her first full-time job. She's now a leader in the field. Many people who came to work for me over the years, because I always tried to find the very best people and create the perfect job for them, are now leaders in the field across LA and across the country. So we began taking in families from shelters, transitional housing programs, drug treatment programs from throughout LA County. The families would stay with those agencies while we relocated them. The first year, we relocated 150 families without any Section 8s, without rent subsidies. We just did it. We had a very low recidivism rate. We had a lot of research going on with this project. And by 1991, I was getting federal grants, demonstration project grants for the project. The first research project had a professor from USC. DeJong was his last name. I meant to look him up. Madeline Stoner from USC School of Social Work worked closely with me for many years as we did various smaller demonstration projects, one for the Pew Partnership for Civic Change, when our Housing First program became one of 19 best practices, and a Welfare to Work competitive grant in which she was our research partner. So we began sharing this innovation almost immediately. Let me tell you a little bit about the innovation. We assigned a case manager to every family. A housing specialist found them housing. The case manager provided 1 full year of case management support to help them stabilize. And I was going to actually write a whole new book just about the concept of engagement and how you break the poverty cycle and how you move people up the ladder through engagement. We found that as soon as we started talking housing to these people, that they sat up straighter and they looked us directly in the eye, because they were beaten down. By the time you're homeless, you've been beaten down. And so the job of the case manager, once we got the family housing, and they were already engaged with us because we were talking housing, by the time we got them into housing, case management was always voluntary. But they were vested in this case manager, who arrived with gifts in the trunk, laundry detergent, laundry baskets for the toys, advice, a survival guide, where to go, connecting them to resources, helping them enroll a child in school. And it's a huge, big piece missing. And that's not case management, it's engagement. Because they were totally engaged, and families that we thought weren't going to maybe make it without a whole lot of help often surprised us and shot through the roof. So we began sharing this innovation almost immediately. We disseminated the model, the approach, the key components, crisis intervention, screening and assessment for social services and housing needs, development of a plan from that, and then moving into housing. You want a plan. You want to have the housing location be appropriate, the landlord a good match. There were a lot of things, family or friends nearby or not, sometimes not, on purpose. And we became very skilled in what we were doing. And so we, the total is, let me see, from 90 to 2011, 200 workshops and presentations in over 75 communities, 30 states and Puerto Rico, including every year national 2-day workshops in LA and DC, always pretty much co-sponsored by the National Alliance to End Homelessness. By the year 2000, I had convinced them to stop being an advocacy group for transitional housing and to convert to a loud voice for housing first. And in fact, they did that. And unfortunately, and I won't go into this because it'll take too long, by 2007, a louder voice for housing first for the chronically homeless on the streets emerged as the sole voice for the term housing first, because the Bush administration and then the Obama administration decided to focus on the visible homeless, which were by then the chronically homeless people on the streets. How much more time do I have? I said I would be asking you this.
Yes, so I'm sure that maybe we can open up to the audience in the next 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, okay, that's what I wondered. All right, so. In 2009, the Housing First approach was integrated into the HEARTH Act, which is the Homeless Emergency Assistance and Rapid Transition to Housing Act of 2009. It hit the streets. In other words, it went into the communities probably around 2012 in terms of changing what they funded. Stop funding shelters and emergency housing and fund mainly rapid rehousing and homeless prevention and permanent supportive housing, which the evaluation of those outcomes of that major change are still to be reported, but they did one rapid rehousing demonstration over a 3-year period under the Obama administration that showed them the efficacy of rapidly rehousing homeless families in particular, and providing them a temporary subsidy for 3 to 6 months. Now, my evaluation of that is that here in LA, what has happened is the families who don't have work histories are being basically warehoused and staying with relatives and friends, or something they're calling bridge housing, which is really emergency shelter or transitional housing, while waiting in line for a Section 8, because the rents, they have to do this. The rents have come up so high that they can't just give them 3 to 6 months rent subsidy and hope that they'll be able to stay in that housing when the subsidy ends. So these are dilemmas to be evaluated of how to address them. I think there are solutions. There are plenty of solutions. And it's just, my experience is that it takes so long to get things done through the federal government that communities really, when the changes came from the Hearth Act, the operators and practitioners in communities across the country had already a setup that was working well. They just needed to adapt the rapid rehousing piece to it, not dismantle everything. But instead, they dismantled everything, and some of what we're seeing today, the articles in the paper about increasing homelessness across the country, are a result of that. Absolutely a result of destroying the system of emergency shelter transitional housing. The way people adapted my model to that, the housing first approach, is they just began moving some families out quicker, even from emergency shelter. It was just a matter of modifying their contracts. So, good intentions, faulty implementation, that really probably is the message that I want to give you. I'm going to jump right now for 2 minutes to my new work. 5 years ago, I started doing new work under Partnering for Change. The goal is to partner for change. The goal is to get the knowledge base we have from dealing in homelessness and housing into the mainstream systems who are the first responders. Housing is the elephant in the room. It's a huge dilemma. People are practitioners who don't deal with housing and homelessness, don't know what to do with it. And so as more and more families endure crisis after crisis, housing instability, shared housing, overcrowded housing, because they don't want to go into a shelter system that really can't accommodate them anymore. What you have is the idea that maybe we can provide the skills through collaboration and education that the first responders need, and better connections and partnerships with the resources that could assist. Stopping an eviction, helping somebody relocate, taking some of the knowledge base back into the community. So I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to tell you about my 5 light bulb moments. And I'm going to probably skip the one PowerPoint presentation I had about the work I'm doing today in the LA Promise Zone, but it is really exciting. If anybody wants to read more about it, it's on my website.
Yeah, so you talked about a series of transitions or kind of light bulb moments. And what was it about the frustration you were experiencing, or the new issues that were showing up that you knew it was time to kind of make the leap from the old to the new? What was that moment? What were you seeing?
When did I know?
Yeah, how did you
It was always a long process because I was constantly getting feedback, monitoring and revising. Although it's interesting, I never changed the main program model for Beyond Shelter, because by the time I did it, I had already been dealing with homeless families in shelter system and on the streets for 5 years. Took me 5 years to figure it out. But it was a light bulb moment because I hadn't gone there yet, that what we needed to do was add a new piece. Let me tell you, in homelessness, you could think out of the box because there was no box. I participated in meetings in the early days in which the few people who were dealing with it were arguing amongst each other whether homeless programs for families should stay with family programs in the community or have a separate system. So, it was enough knowledge and experience and feedback and research. I always, I was doing everything parallel to the research, and I would quote the research in my request for funding. It was, just sometimes I acted. Everyone else was maybe feeling like me, but I acted because I'm not good day to day. I'm really good on just looking at the challenges. What works, what doesn't. If it's working, I'm not there. I know that's working. I'm looking at what's not working. What do we need to fix? And the best way to do that is to take a look at the existing systems. A long time ago, I learned we can't wipe it clean, because I would do that, wipe the slate clean and start all over. But I had to admit I couldn't do that. I had to deal with use what I had to work with. But my training is as an abstract painter, honestly. And so I don't color within the lines, and so if somebody was going to probably take a step out there, it's probably going to be me, 1 foot on the ground, but the other in outer space. A friend once described me. You know, I would just throw the pieces together in my mind until it emerged as, well, this will be cost effective. It's catalytic innovation at its best. It's sometimes a simpler solution or just a logical solution based on everything that's there, what piece is missing. And I also like to think that I bridge the gap between research and policymakers and the practitioners in the field, because I go from both ends. I start with clients and impact, and I'm also doing this, and I try to bridge them in the middle, and that is a missing piece today. And if somebody can come up with that, that'll be a great gift to the world, because there's a lot of good evidence based on what we should be doing and not a lot of knowledge based on how to implement. My brain works that way, but only by looking at what's there and how can we adjust it.
If I were a 19-year-old USC student, that I'm not anymore, never was as a matter of fact, majoring in urban studies or public policy or planning, or a graduate student in an MSW, or what would be a 25-word elevator speech you'd give to me about a career in social innovation?
I would say that there's a lot. Oh, wait, do I have to count?
No, you can fudge a little bit, yeah.
I would say that there is a lot of suffering in the world and a lot of people without a voice, and that if you position yourself and understand that your privilege allows you to be the voice for people whose voices cannot be heard, then you should go for it. That you absolutely should not think that your voice doesn't matter, because your voice is everybody else's voice who can't speak for themselves. That's what you can do, and it's not that hard. To speak up today. Of course, you have to get yourself to the table. I think that brings up that federal proclamation that I passed out. That's really interesting. In 1993, one of my program supervisors for a federal grant at HHS smuggled out the president's proclamation on homelessness, which had the word "the homeless" in 5 places. And it was supposed to be okayed by HHS before going back to the White House. And I crossed out "the homeless" everywhere, those 5 places, and I rewrote. I wish I had saved that. I save everything. It must be somewhere. Homeless individuals and families. And I've recently been doing, and it came out that way. That's the change that came out in the Federal Register. Now, I've been doing some research for my book, and I found another book written about how under the Clinton administration they started using the term homeless individuals and families. I knew it would have a ripple effect for years. So it broadened the concept of vision of what you were thinking about. And in fact, the whole label, the homeless, came from early research at Columbia University in the late 70s, when they saw the first homeless people on the streets. They didn't want to call them vagrants. They didn't want to call them hobos, because they weren't just mentally ill. There were a lot of different people being dislocated. So they called them the homeless, with the idea that that would mean the fix is homes, right? That was the original intent. That didn't happen. Now you use the term experiencing homelessness, because the homeless is a bad term. Homeless, just eradicated, okay? Yes.
Why?
Why? Why what?
Why did calling somebody or referring to a category of people as the homeless acquire such a negative effect in
Well, part of that has to do with what I experienced. I found that as the funding started coming into the communities and we had to screen out people who weren't really homeless, they were staying with relatives or friends that doesn't think they're homeless. or living in a hotel with their own money. Let me just say that over time, it became apparent that we were both institutionalizing and creating a growth industry to deal with a new subclass in society, and that subclass was called the homeless. And that's what I think is here to stay. And New York has a right to shelter, which I'm very much against. I've been in a big argument with Steve Arnold on Facebook over this recently. I've had people from New York who work in the field tell me that the right to shelter was a big mistake in New York and they wish they could get rid of it, because New York is now building 60 new shelters for families with children and other homeless people because they can't empty their shelters. They don't have a mechanism to get the families out of shelters. Although they tried the Housing First approach for a while, they never funded the subsidies and the rents are too high. And so you have generations of children who are growing up in a subclass mentality, and they are homeless. They are the homeless. Everybody knows they're the homeless. They're enrolled in the school as under the homeless. You know, I mean, sometimes you have to admit that what you've been doing is wrong and maybe there's a different way to do it. I think if you had a right to housing, they would have done things quite differently. Yes?
Well, the reason for me, it's a matter of self-discipline to always try to say people who, no matter what it is. Right?
To say what?
It's a matter of self-discipline to say people who, regardless of if it's experiencing homelessness or people who have autism or people with mental illness, and simply because, and you know, so for me, again, it's like people who voted this way, people who believe this, because it reminds me that they're people first. And like I said, it's a matter of self-discipline for me as much as it is a matter of leadership in reminding people that the group of our client population are people first, right? And that they're, whatever struggles that they're dealing with, whatever differences they have, those are part of a whole package.
Well, and there's another thing that goes along with that, and that is when you become homeless, you come under a microscope. And every blemish and every issue is visible. People who, in Puerto Rico, when I spoke there, they called them people without roofs, okay? They're like everybody else, they just don't have a roof over their head. There are people with disabilities, dysfunctions, mental illness, bad parenting skills, great creative capabilities who are homeless and who are not homeless. The only difference between, and every research decade after decade says the same thing, the difference between, for example, homeless families and non-homeless families, whatever they may look like, you know, in subgroups or whatever, is that the non-homeless family had relatives or friends able to take them in, which usually meant in the middle class because they weren't in a rent-restricted unit that didn't allow visitors to stay for more than 2 weeks. So my first research paper that I looked at and used as a Bible and still have with me every day when I'm doing this work was the 1991 Stanford University study on homeless families, children, and youth. And it's underlined. And I used it as my guide. This was in 1991. They were bringing me up there to speak once a year. One year, I tried speaking and calling the homeless people without housing. And they never called me back. And for years, I thought it was because it sounded so ridiculous. I never used the term the homeless, but I said people without housing over and over again. And 15 years later, I found out that the department was closed and it wasn't me.
I do have another question.
It's a true story.
I do have another question for you, and this is for some of my students who are in the room. In my community development class, we're having some struggles with, you know, how do you keep going when everything seems so pointless, when everything seems so partial, and you don't really get a chance to make huge changes? And how do you answer that question?
Well, you know what I did. I just stepped off into outer space each time. I mean, it was going out on a limb every time, but it was not just without a lot of deep thought behind it and research. And so, you know, you take your own actions within your world, and there's always something more that you can do. With me, when I started Beyond Shelter, I found a private donor that I had been talking about how upset I was and I couldn't keep doing this work with the shelters, and I quit the day my biggest and best model shelter opened. I mean, that's the day I announced I'm leaving. She funded me for 3 months. She gave me $50,000, and I researched around the country because I knew what I was thinking. I needed to see what other people were thinking. I found nothing like what I was planning to do. I found something similar in transitional housing programs that were scattered, but they were program housing, and housing that's program housing is not your housing. So you're required to behave a certain way and do certain things in order to keep that housing. So I was just learning as I went along. I mean, I probably should have just stayed in academia. I love the research, the writing, the thinking, the evaluating, the revising. I love it. I'm applying it to the real world. And you can apply it to the real world. My staff at Beyond Shelter, because what we were dealing with so many, every case is different. Every single situation, every family situation is different. And you can't just do it from formula. You cannot. I used to allow my staff to do what they had to do, as long as they had 3 commandments. Keep me out of jail, never give money back. What was the other one? Oh, and I don't like surprises, okay? And so they did things that made a difference in people's lives, that had they not been given that permission, they would have had to stop at 5 o'clock or not, do what they had to do. Yeah.
So I have a comment / reflection, which may be on point, and please correct it if it's not, and then just in a question. So I'm really struck by your light bulb moment and how it was embedded in a context of both learning from outside where you were working and learning from on the street where you were working. And so, in search of the light bulb moment, you had a process around you that enabled such light bulbs to occur and then for action to be taken. And I think that's super powerful and really speaks to what the process of social innovation is. I don't know if that reflection is accurate, at least in summarizing what I heard. But
I think it was very accurate. As you start thinking about things and researching and talking to other people and watching and experiencing, you move forward. It's just like when you deliver case management to somebody who's got some problems, you can't label them and think they're going to be like that for the next 20 years, which is my problem with some of the systems today. Because if you deliver interventions, there's going to be change. And with me, I always move forward in that direction that I was going with new knowledge, because I went looking for it, and something might divert me in a slightly other direction. I can tell you this. I'm not real good at beating down barriers, but you learned how to go around them. And I've gone around them over and over again. And found a new way, a new route, and brought people along with me. And I think your statement is exactly right. Please write it down so I can add it to my presentation.
Well, I was about to write down this last statement, which was that I'm not good at beating down barriers, but I'm good at going around them. So that'll show up in a tweet.
And that's how I know what to do each day. I don't know what to do.
All right, thank you.
I know what to do each step in my work because of the barrier that has presented itself. For example, at some point with Beyond Shelter, we needed Section 8s. We found out that there was an application process to HUD in which you could get dedicated Section 8s for homeless people. So Shelter Partnership, Housing Authority, City of LA, and Beyond Shelter wrote the application and got 4,000 Section 8s every year for 20 years into the city, dedicated to 10 different organizations. And I wondered why, when I speak around the country, why other cities weren't doing that. They just didn't think of it. I modified the continuum of care under the Clinton administration because I went to a meeting in DC that had been advertised that they were, it was open to the public the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty was doing it. Some of you may have that chart where there's a line up above. It shows the continuum of care that they were designing: emergency shelter, transitional housing, permanent housing. I mean, you have to be out there. I was at this working meeting at a church. I went to Washington quite often for a number of years, every few months or 6 weeks, before and after the Clinton administration came in. And it is a small town, and you can be at the table. And I saw those arrows, and I added one with a pencil underneath that went directly from shelter over to 2 types of housing: supportive housing or just fair market housing. I modified that numerous times, by the way, on my own work. It came out that way. I flew back to LA when the book came out, Priority Home, Clinton's Plan to End Homelessness. My line was down there. I remember when I did it, Marcia Martin, the new director of the Interagency Council on the Homeless, said, "Oh, that's interesting." It's scary, you know. It's really scary.
So my question was related to some of the things you're talking about, how the innovation leads to systems change. I know one of the frustrations in some of the conversations around philanthropy and nonprofits is there's always a session on impact and scale, or scaling up, or those kinds of things. But people struggle a lot about even how to talk about what that means in social impact work a lot of times. I wonder if you could talk about what that means to scale. And I hesitate in even using that word, but it's pretty evident that Housing First started in a place, and then now it became a movement.
Well, you know, the movement is taking somebody else's housing first. Mine already went to scale. As it came out over the past 10 years, all the implementation looks like Housing First for the chronically homeless. Okay, and the innovator of that Housing First and I used to speak together on panels, and we were very clear, and there are papers out on the clear differences. You don't do Housing First for families where you just put them into housing and there's no requirement for services, although ours are never mandatory. If children are involved, single people, children are not involved. When children are involved, it better be children first. And I'm beginning to speak out on that nationally because I'm basically horrified. I have at least 5 dead babies in my career from mismanagement by a case manager or a AmeriCorps worker or the system. And I will, or me, and I will never, ever let that out of my mind. Okay, so, but my Housing First went to scale because I'm a teacher at heart. I understood that what I was doing, LA is an animal unto itself. What I was doing in LA, and every community is different, and what I found, let me just say this, things change enough in an environment every 2 years that you better just have the key components strong, set, and able to withstand and be flexible enough to withstand the changes in leadership, funding, administrations, and that is exactly what I did. So I ended up just extricating the key components. I never, ever disseminated information that was strictly about my work. I did 10 years of work on service-enriched housing. I taught state housing finance agencies what service-enriched housing was. Service-enriched housing comes from my work in LA Family Housing. It's affordable housing for the low-income population at large, not necessarily dedicated to people at risk or with special needs, but capable of monitoring them and providing crisis intervention, resource referral, and resident participation in decision making. And when state housing finance agencies needed to, and so I put a team together of people doing this kind of work in St. Paul, Minnesota, Philadelphia, managers, owners, developers working as a team, PowerPoint presentations. And I taught state housing finance agencies that weren't funding but were beginning to require a services component in their housing. And this is how things go. I was privileged to be on special committees at these 3 major organizations in DC I talked about earlier. National Alliance to End Homelessness, National Low Income Housing Coalition, and the National Law Center on Housing and Homelessness. With the last one, I helped push the right to housing movement in the US, which evolved out of our participation at the UN conference Habitat II in 1996 in Istanbul, Turkey. With the National Alliance, it was of course Housing First. With the National Low Income Housing Coalition, I argued for equal time to the term service-enriched housing, which is not as costly as permanent supportive housing, doesn't make people wait in some homeless limbo because they meet the criteria, but in fact allows them to move into housing in the community at large and still have access to the key components, which is crisis intervention, resource referral, and monitoring for special needs if in fact you have them. So I sound like somebody who's really angry at everything everybody's doing, and you know what? I am, because I've spent 40 years in this. I have speeches that started out during the first decade of homelessness, we did this. And then I modify it. As we enter our second decade of homelessness, third decade, we're in our fourth decade of homelessness and it's getting worse. And all this money is going out. It's going to go into a deep, dark hole. There will be no impact on the streets from Triple H, I promise you, or the county plan to end homelessness. I'm sorry to say that. I want my voice to be heard because I believe it firmly. If some changes aren't made in implementation strategies, then we're going to, 10 years from now, see as bad as it is now, and it's horrible, it'll be worse. And I might end, but I don't have to end, but I might end on this. In the 80s, when we first had homeless people on the streets, and we would meet together in the city fathers and the nonprofits and philanthropy to try to figure out a solution, we were horrified. We wouldn't allow that. This had to change. We had to get these people off the streets. There weren't that many there. Decade after decade, our level of tolerance got so high that it's normal now to see people on the streets. I've spoken to student groups who never knew a world that didn't have homeless people living in it. We can do much better than this, but it's also interesting is that my foray into politics and policy and the federal government, I coordinated the roundtable on housing and homelessness for the Clinton campaign. I can't begin to tell you the infighting I found out about people vying for jobs and who got them and what background they had for those jobs that would impact any decision they made. Hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. It was really a shocking experience for me. It's sort of like a child that thinks its parents are all-knowing and powerful and finding out as they grow up that they don't know it all, except this one. You know, I mean, often local, state, federal government has no idea what it's doing. A lot of stuff is just arbitrary, and whoever has the loudest voice sometimes gets heard. During 20 years of federal government funding of transitional housing, as you know, where you would learn to live independently, my voice was out there being heard, and I taught people how to use those grants to do housing first. They would identify families who were able to get out of housing as quickly as possible, get them out of their programs without having to stay for 2 years and go through 3 parenting sessions that were humiliating. You know, I spoke to clients always. I always knew. My phone was out there. It still is to this day. And I hear what people are going through. And the staff knew it. The staff knew in these programs that this woman was as capable as them of living independently. And so then they would reallocate funding to have a case manager do the home visiting after moving the family so that they got the services normally given in transitional housing instead given after they had relocated the family to housing. So there, we used the contract with the same language. We just turned around what was done when. And so I urge you, if you are in programs or you go to work in programs that don't look right to you, and I hear this all the time from my student mentees from UCLA, in the 3 schools of social welfare, urban planning, and public policy, the 3 departments, step up,
With that,
modify.
oh, that's a great way to end. Step up. Thank you so much for not staying in academia, but yet doing the work you do, where the world is a better place for it.
Thank you.